Right there's corner.
Yeah.
All right, well, why don't we go ahead and get started? Welcome to the colloquium this afternoon. It's sponsored by the Department of Political Science, Department of Ethnic Studies, and the Center for Southeast Asian Studies. So we're very excited that this is a collaborative and interdisciplinary event today. I want to give also a quick shout out to the members of the Asia group that we formed, graduate students and faculty between the Political Science Department and Sociology, who are also here and involved today. My name is Ejito Kimura. I'm a faculty in political science, and I'm also a executive board member at the Center for Southeast Asian Studies. And we're really happy that we were able to make this a reality. Our speaker today wrote me a few months ago and was like, hey, maybe we can work on something. And I thought this is great. And you know, there's a lot of things that go on behind the scenes, and especially when you do something collaboratively, and then when you do something online and all these kinds of things. So I especially just want to recognize our staff or our members of the colloquium committee: Sarah, Sasta Moinen, Maludia Lo, Randizia Cristosotomo, Ken Reyes, Stephanie Sovitz, and Ari Eisenstadt, and also our staff members at graduate assistants at the Center for Southeast Asian Studies, Sabun Nim and Ariel Alves. Thank you guys for really helping out and making it. The only other thing I'll say, please remember to sign in. And also, there is a potluck event at the Center for Southeast Asian Studies, and they always have the best food. And so you're welcome to join. Anyone's welcome to come to that event as well. Unfortunately, our guest today won't be able to make it, but we can talk about him. So turning to our esteemed guest, Joel Selway is an associate professor of political science at Brigham Young University and also an associate faculty at their Asian Studies program. He's half Thai, Sawat, as in Sawat D, right? Means good fortune. And he says he's felt like he's had a lot of good fortune. We had a lot of really interesting conversations over lunch today about his background and upbringing and experience. His first book he published with Cambridge University Press, looking at the politics of healthcare in developing countries, and has since then received Fulbright fellowships, grants from the NSF, and published in really the top journals in both political science and in Asian studies as well. And so we are delighted today to have Joel present and talk about ethnic identity and ethnic politics in Thailand. So welcome.
Thank you. Thank you, Ejito, for such a generous introduction. I'm really happy to be here. I'm in a department which sounds like from Ejito's description is at the polar opposite of over here. I'm in a department that has mostly Americanist political scientists who were trained in statistics and experiments and methodologies and things like that. So it's actually a real treat for me to come here and get some real area studies, expertise and feedback on this project, which is a book project, which I'm somewhat close to finishing, hope to be finished next semester. But it's something I've been working on for the past 7 years. So even though I'm half Thai, I didn't grow up speaking Thai. And so I studied Thai at university and eventually went on to Chiang Mai to do the advanced study of Thai program. And so I then went on and finished my PhD, did my first book. But I had a very different picture of Chiang Mai when I lived there to do that program. And then I came across these events that started happening in 2013 and 2014, where we had some small groups who were beginning to do what I describe as separatist agitations, right? We shouldn't think about violence, arms building, hiding out in the jungles, but they were definitely talking about and vocalizing this wish. So I just really wanted to explore this. I wondered how widely felt it was in that region. More than anything, it kind of broke this myth that I think I'm just trying to get it to go to the next slide. See if that works. Okay, that works now. This myth sometimes that we have of a homogeneous Thailand, right? And this myth has been very well communicated by the government and by scholars over time. We talk about that. Now, just real quick, I use this term nationalism. I understand that colloquially people use it in different ways. Generally, I find when I talk about nationalism, people think it's the bad thing that happened during World War II in Europe. And in America, we tend to use the word patriotism, right? But more generally, we kind of use it neutrally as an ideology that emphasizes loyalty, devotion, or allegiance to a nation or a nation state. You might want to think of just national identity. So I didn't want to trip anybody up if I started using that and you were thinking I was talking about German fascism or something like that. So just to kind of motivate this project in terms of why I think it's important, since World War II, arguably the largest interstate war we've had in the history of mankind, there have only been, and I say only because I don't want to downplay these, but there's, in comparison to civil wars, there's only been 25 interstate wars between this time period, 3.3 million battle deaths, only 25 states involved, and they've lasted on average 3 months. We compare this to civil wars, most of which are separatist civil wars. We've had 127 in that time period, with over 16.2 million deaths. It's involved 73 states, more than a third of all of the United Nations system, and they've lasted on average roughly 6 years. So in terms of kind of like the academic focus on civil wars, we've had much more kind of focus on interstate wars and less so, but increasingly so on these types of wars. Civil wars also involve much more refugee flows, and if we think about some of the worst examples in Afghanistan, Somalia, Lebanon, they cause extreme economic devastation. So kind of understanding and preempting them before they get to this stage is partly what I wanted to understand, because in Chiang Mai, in Lanna, that activity came as such a shock to me, and we haven't got to anything like full-blown separatist civil war yet. So I thought, I wonder why scholars don't kind of study these dogs that haven't quite barked very loudly yet. We always kind of write books on the ones where we had the wars, but we don't really understand well why places don't have full-out civil wars. Okay, so that's just a quick quote there from a couple of political scientists, Fearon and Leighton, who note that civil war has been a far greater scourge than interstate war in this period, and you can kind of track the increase over time of these things. So when we think of civil wars in Thailand, we normally think of the 3 southern provinces on the border of Malaysia that has been involved in what we term a civil war for the past 20 years. Many explanations of this civil war just say, well, of course they have a civil war, they're different than the majority, right? They're Muslim, they're Malay rather than Buddhist and Thai. That's why we have civil wars down there. And I find those types of explanations not to be super satisfactory. In fact, one of the things that I love about visiting Hawaii is we have a lot of diversity here, but generally, right, people get along. So you can have diversity and it doesn't have to be a negative thing. But there have been tons and tons of books written on this topic in southern Thailand. Generally, when we think of Thailand, though, we think of a fairly homogeneous nation. So I pulled this from my favorite CIA World Fact book. This is what they're teaching American diplomats, apparently. Thailand being 97.5% Thai, 90.7% of the population speaking Thai. I don't even know where they got these particular figures from. But again, it's this myth, right, that Thailand is homogeneous. And if you go to 2016 and the Platinum Jubilee of the now late King of Thailand, you may have been convinced that this was indeed an accurate picture of Thailand, and it's not completely inaccurate. But during 2016, you see here in front of the Grand Palace, we literally have millions of Thais coming together, holding candles, holding up pictures of the king, and you would not be mistaken if you thought, wow, there is a very strong sense of national identity in this country. So here's another picture of diversity in Thailand, one by ethno-linguistic differences. Of course, we have our Malays down here. We have some kind of different Burman hill tribes on the west. We have our Khmer population here in the east. And this is one that I like to point out. So we have our central Thai group here around Bangkok. But then we have these other Thai Kadai languages, Lanna, Isan, and Baktai languages as well, which are more akin to kind of the differences we see within Romance languages. So I think Spain is always a kind of good comparison here. We have Castilian Spain around Madrid. If you ask most people what language they speak in Spain, they tell you they speak Spanish, right? Castilian Spanish. But then, of course, we know that in Barcelona, they speak Catalonian, which is as distant from Castilian as Portuguese and Italian are, right? So this is how some of these regions are within Thailand. And so just as soon as we kind of get to this ethno-linguistic difference, it kind of poses a different question about if Thailand has been so successful in the previous picture, in this picture, how has it been so successful given these differences, which are at least as large as they are within Spain? So this is part of the puzzle. Now, this particular pattern gets even more interesting when you consider the electoral differences over the past 6 elections. So here we have 2001. And if we just roughly follow the differences in colors, you can see the north and the northeast here, the Lanna and Isan, just vote differently than they do in the central region and in the south, right? 2001, 2005, very stark difference. 2007, we get through to 2011. This is the referendum. I always like this map. Whoever made this map is just brilliant, right? The military camouflage here. This was a referendum on a military written constitution. Again, these 2 regions stand out not voting in favor of that, and of course, our Malay region down in the south. And this is the most recent elections in 2019. That's an awful lot of reinforcing of ethnic difference with kind of with voting patterns. Now, of course, some of you may know some of this history within Thailand, that it's not just that they voted for these different parties, it's that the elite establishment has continually overturned that electoral vote. First in 2006 with a coup, again in 2014, a couple times in between with some non-constitutional means, my favorite of which was charging the sitting prime minister with receiving a travel grant for a period on a cooking show. That's probably going to be the best dismissal in the history of prime ministers. But regardless, we've had 4 prime ministers that the majority of the north and the northeast, the Lanna and the Isan regions have voted for, ousted by non-constitutional means, right? These are grounds for what we generally think of as a grievance, right? A political grievance, continual political exclusion, maybe even political repression, on top of maybe some ethnic prejudices, right? I wouldn't go so far as to say that there's ethnic hatred per se, but certainly there are prejudices. Now, one of the things that's interesting about these 2 regions are the different ways in which they've responded to this same grievance. Most reporters that have reported on this have kind of put them all together as red shirts, right, versus yellow shirts from the center and from the south. But there is some difference between these 2 red regions, right? Yes, they're both red. They both have the same 4 prime ministers that the majority of them voted for, ousted by. But when we think of grievances, it's actually the Isan region that, by standard measures, we might think is more aggrieved. There are higher levels of economic inequality there. By other models, they have a neighboring ethnic kin in next door Laos, which is a large source for the start of civil wars across the world. And they have much more negative stereotypes against them. There's even programs to fight racism that they feel from the center. Most of this racism is based on skin color. They are generally perceived as being darker, at least historically. There are accusations that they're not civilized, right? by the way, this is not my view or portrayal, but you know, they often get called country bumpkins, right? They don't have any civilization, and their food often gets downplayed as being stinky and non-civilized, right? Now, in contrast, and this is the view of Chiang Mai that I got when I did my study of advanced Thai. This is a place Bangkokians love to go tour in, right? And they think it's kind of like this idyllic view of Thailand, at least historically. So, right, we have traditional dress, we have soft-spoken people, they have their own aspects of culture, they have these beautiful Buddhist temples, right, that they love to go and pay patronage to. So just very different kind of stereotypes between these two groups. So you might be forgiven when Time magazine in 2014 publishes this and says, oh, it's going to be the Isan region in the northeast, the ones that are like those ethnic Laos, they're going to start a civil war. Interestingly enough, in that same year, as Time magazine published this, these banners began being hung from bridges across the whole of the north of Thailand. So this says that this country has no justice, we want a separate Lanna state, right? In early 2014, we begin seeing these all over the north of Thailand. And then we see some minor protests, right? But they are calling very explicitly for a separate Lanna state, holding up signs publicly, right? And there's that same sign being held up by a group. And behind these banners, although the Thai police actually pinned it on a couple of poor elderly guys from goodness knows where, they arrested them and put them in jail. The groups generally perceived to be behind them are quite well known in the north. This is the leader of one of the groups, and this is how she describes their organization. Our aims are firstly to fight for true democracy in Thailand. That makes sense, it's kind of a general red shirt thing. Secondly, to show respect and protect people who do good in society. Thirdly, to protect the sacred culture of Lanna, right? That's right in there as one of their express aims. And this is not a unique organization in the north. So we do have red shirt organizations across the north and northeast. They just took on a very different flavor in the north than they did in the northeast. This is a picture of the Prime Minister Yingluck Shinawatra, who herself is from Chiang Mai. So she's from the capital of Lanna, and she's appearing next to one of these groups. The Love Chiang Mai 51 group, who is fairly well known to have separatist tendencies. Again, not violent, right? This is more kind of like our Scottish Catalonian thing. This was very controversial when she appeared with them. Okay, so that's kind of the puzzle that I want to talk about. Why did this happen in Lanna and not in Isan? And to do that, and this is kind of the working title of the book, I look at something that I call styles of nationalism. And the argument in some ways is very simple, that different regions develop different styles of nationalism during the creation of the modern Thai state. So what do I mean by styles of nationalism? Well, first of all, let's talk about how generally people use and measure nationalism in political science. Generally, they treat it like psychologists treat a personality trait. It's something that's either dichotomous, so for example, you're an introvert or extrovert. So in this case, you either adopt the national identity or you don't, right? That's dichotomous. Or it's linear. Some regions have strong national identities, some have weak, right? So you're more extroverted or you're less introverted. And that could be helpful to some extent, but I think it kind of simplifies a very kind of complex phenomenon that I think nationalism is. And so I like to describe my styles of nationalism more along the lines of a personality type, right? So we know A-type and B-type personalities. I kind of like the 16 personalities like INFJ and things like that, right? They are categories that try and encapsulate a whole bunch of different things into one particular style, right? And so different aspects that I try and talk about within these styles of nationalism, the main ones are the degree that the group feels accepted as part of the nation, the degree it wants to be part of the nation, and then how they describe the relationship between the nation and their own ethno-region. So these are just some of the aspects that I think are behind a much more complex idea of what a style of nationalism is, rather than just saying, hey, the Malays, they're not Thai, right? They don't have the national identity. Well, actually, the story of Patani and the Malay South is much more complicated than that. They were a long time associated with the Siamese state. and called on Siam many times in the past to help them in trade disputes that they had with other mailing subjects. So in general, though, I've identified 4 different styles of nationalism, and I'm going to lay them out here. And they go with each of these different regions. Now, just quickly here, one of the reasons I wanted to do this is I wanted to incorporate the study of the South, the Malay South, and compare it with other regions in Thailand, rather than just say the South is different. We should just consider it differently. I think a lot of the history of Pattani looks quite similar to these other states in the pre-modern region. And so, it's kind of nice to put it in the same theoretical framework for once. So certainly in Pattani, they have a style of nationalism. And again, this is not to say that everybody in this region has this particular style of nationalism. It's kind of like the average, type of nationalism in that region. So the first one is called ersatz nationalism. This is a German word meaning false or fake. And it's a nationalism whereby people refuse to accept that your ethnic group was ever or should ever be part of the modern nation state. Hence the term ersatz. So in Lanna, we have something that I've labeled posterior nationalism. So nationalism is coming posterior to the regional identity. So it's the belief that one's ethnic group came first, is superior to, or to which the national identity is a subset of. And I'm going to give some more examples of these to kind of flesh them out in a second. In the south, what is normally known as southern Thailand, they call themselves Konbaktai. We have something called equinationalism. It's a belief that your group is equal to or strongly favored by the dominant national group. And lastly, we have the type of nationalism, the style of nationalism, which I think they have in Isan, which is, I call it anterior nationalism, a belief that one's ethnic group came after, is inferior to, or is a subset of the national identity. Now, this is not part of this talk, but I have actually done some of this survey work to test these categories in both the UK, which is where I'm from, if you can't tell by the accent already, and also in Spain, most recently in Spain. And these categories actually hold up very well for different regions in different parts of the world, measuring them through surveys. Which brings me on to kind of fleshing out these styles of nationalism in surveys. So I undertook a national survey in Thailand, 5,500 respondents, at least 800 in each region. On part of this survey, I asked them a simple open-ended question at the end. I asked them to define what Thainess means. In Thai, it's Thai. They could write as little or as much as they wanted. Some people would just write a single phrase. Some people wrote whole essays, right? And then one of the fortunate things at BYU is there are a lot of returned missionaries who have learned Thai. And they often learn it very well. And so I had a whole army of them helping me translate these back into English. And then we coded them to try and make sense of what people had done. We came up with 10 categories in the end, and I'm not going to give you the full kind of results of all of these. In the book, for example, you might find some interesting things like how many people mention nation, king, and religion. You'll be surprised. Actually, very few people, if you just ask them what Thainess is, very few people actually say the official triumvirate of nation, religion, and king. And it varies by region, as you might expect. But these are the different categories. These are the types of things people would say about the national identity and about their own kind of regional identity. But what I wanted to kind of leave you with today is to kind of give you a sense of the types of things that respondents in Lanna said compared to the types of things respondents in Isan said. So these are the types of things Isan said. So Isan people are Thai people. They're not different from other regions. An Isan person is a Thai person that lives in the Isan region. Even though we speak Isan and have culture like Isan people, we are still just one people that was born in Thailand. Isan people are a part of Thailand. Isan people should not be looked down upon. This makes one feel that they are Thai Isan person. Isan people are a subset of Thai people. Isan person is someone in Thailand that has Thai blood. It's the same as a Thai person. Are you getting a sense of what we're talking about yet? People who have grown up as sticky rice children, I love this one. This is describing Isan people, but whose parents must be real Thai people, right? Even though they have Isanness. If their mother or father is from Laos, to me it means they're not full Isan child, right? And he goes on here, and I love this one, they tell us off. Do not think to separate lands by region, right? We had a number of people tell us off like this. Here we go over here. If you will ask us this question, it means that you want to split the country. I want to ask you, and they're asking our survey people this, are you a Thai person or not? Why do you have to ask us this question, right? Now, of course, not everybody's responding this way, but nobody else responds like this in any other region of the country, right? We have responses like this over and over and over again in the Isan region. So this is kind of where I have termed it, this anterior nationalism, this idea that they definitely want to be accepted as Thai, right? But somehow they don't feel fully accepted. And there's been a lot of work by Jacob Ricks, who's a scholar in Singapore, who's done a number of different surveys looking at this, that Isan people, rather than this picture of Time magazine, right, that want to start a civil war, more than anything, actually, they want to be accepted as full members of the Thai nation. So, in contrast, this is what our Lanna people say. And this is what a vast majority of them talk about when you get them to describe their own regional identity and national identity. They talk about their ancestors and history all the time. Our ancestors have a great and long history. It's about having faith in the history and beauty of the beautiful culture and traditions of the Lanna people, the identity of the Northern or Lanna people, which is preserved in history and inheritance. We have a long-lived culture and history, long inherited way of life, knowing the history and background of Lanna, history, right? Almost nobody in the Isan region mentions anything about history, right? But a lot of people in the north, in the Lanna region in the north, when they talk about their identities, they are talking about history. And so I've tried to encapsulate the kind of, and the overall thing, I've tried to give a holistic description, right, of these different identities. So here are the central Thai, and the central Thais tend to just talk about who gets to be a member of the nation or not. They're very good at saying you only get to be it if you were born here, or if you speak here, or if you've lived in here for this many years. So they're all about setting the rules on who gets to be Thai. The Lanna people are obsessed with history, preservation of history. That's the most important aspect of their own identity and of Thainess. So I've come up with this phrase, we're Thai because Thais are us, right? We're the original Thais. And so if you look at the history of Lanna, which I'll talk about in a second, their history predates the creation of the first Siamese central Thai state. So they're like, go ahead and call us Thai. We don't care what you call us, right? As long as you recognize that you actually kind of come from us, right? So sure, we'll all be called Thais, but we're the original Thais, right? And so that's kind of their flavor, their style of nationalism. In the South, they give really nonchalant answers. They're like, yeah, I don't really care that I'm answering this question. So I've kind of come up with this phrase, yeah, sure, we're Thai, whatever you say, right? They accept it. Over here in Isan, like I said, it's like, please accept us as Thai, right? And these, you know, like I said, there's variation within each region, but these things definitely come out, right? And I have like different students coding the different responses using this criteria, and these things definitely stand out within each region. Now, one thing I will say, you'll notice I don't have the 3 southern provinces here. It's because the survey companies wouldn't go there during that period of time. It was early 2020. Okay, so I'm going to talk a little bit about where these styles of nationalism come from. And so this is one of the things that I find quite interesting in all of the different books, and there's been many books written on Thai nationalism, right? All the way from Thongchai's great Siam Mat to Vela and Vela's Chayo, right? There's been a lot of ink spilt on nationalism. And I have scoured through these books over the last 5 years. There is almost nothing written about the periphery in these books, right? It's almost assumed that the periphery just follows the center, right? They get incorporated, they become part of the central administration through montons. They get the educational system, they adopt the central Thai language, boom. Somehow at the end of the 20th century, they're all Thai, right? But actually, if you look carefully through each of these books, there's very little written on what happens in the periphery during these different periods of time. Now, there are great historians, and many of them are Thai, who have written on this subject, but there's nowhere where it's kind of compiled together. So I was interested in where these styles of nationalism came from, and So I use a historical approach, and if there are any historians in the room, I'm just going to apologize right now, right? We are not historians in political science, but we do rely on history. We use something called comparative historical analysis, and we focus on, we have this term called historical institutionalism. And again, most historian friends that I have just are like, yeah, you're not doing real history, but we're not trying to do real history, right? We are trying to do what we call comparative historical analysis. So just a little bit on how we term this, because we use this phrase historical institutionalism, which is a social science approach that emphasizes how timing, sequences, and something called path dependence, which I'll explain in a little bit, affect institutions and shape social, political, economic behavior and change. And just real quick on institutions, because we have a very specific meaning for it, humanly devised structures of rules and norms that shape and constrain individual behavior. Mostly we think of these formal institutions, we think of formal institutions like constitutions, electoral rules, procedural rules, and things like that. But it also includes all of our informal institutions like norms, traditions, and culture. Now I'm going to apologize to anthropologists, right? Because political scientists very broadly just say culture is an informal institution, right? We don't go much deeper than that. So I'm just going to apologize right now. But what we do say is that a culture that we end up with in the 21st century is dependent on the history, on historic things in a systematic way. So national identity is an institution because it shapes and constrains individual behavior. If you're watching the World Cup right now, you've probably already been constrained by this behavior over the last couple of weeks. I know I have. I'm probably going to be crying next week either because we win or lose, right? When England win or lose. I'm shaped by this institution, right? I give this one as well on BYU campus in Provo. They play the national anthem twice at 8 a.m. and 6 p.m. Oh. Here I am as an Englishman when I first get there. I just walk straight through campus, right? I have no idea what's going on. And after a few months, I'm like, I think people are stopping during the national anthem. Because I really wasn't paying attention. And then once I stopped to notice, they're all stopping there, putting their hand on their heart, right? I'm like, this is a really interesting institution, right? Which is a very regional flavor of Americanism in Utah. By the way, I think Utah fits very well like that Isan anterior nationalism, where they are desperate to be accepted as Americans, right? We'll talk about that later. But in general, right, we think of national identity as a culture, as an institution that shapes how you behave and think. Okay, so history matters in this, and there are two crucial periods. The first one is what we call this period of path dependence. It's kind of like the furthest we go back in history, we ask ourselves, well, what was regional identity? What was national identity? We didn't have nations in the pre-modern era, but what was it like in the pre-modern era? So I asked this question, how autonomous or cohesive was the region in the pre-modern era? And this sets regions on a path dependency, right? So if in the pre-modern era you were more autonomous and more cohesive, you're likely to be more autonomous and cohesive in the modern era. Unless you were set on a different trajectory by something that we label a critical juncture. And this second historic period, I look at the period where the modern nation state was created. So we're talking about late 1800s, early 1900s. We see this as a critical juncture, and our different regions get treated differently in this time period, and then have different historic trajectories too. So if we take these first two types of nationalism, our ersatz one, this is the one down in the Malay South, and our posterior nationalism, the one in Lanna, both of these regions were highly autonomous and cohesive in the pre-modern era. And I'm going to talk a little bit about their histories in a second. But because during the process of creating the modern nation state, the Malay states were treated in a much more conflictual way. The last Malay Sultan of Patani was actually arrested and put in prison in peaceful law at the end of the 1800s. Whereas in Lanna, the last king of Lanna lasted until 1939, right? So what many people don't know is that Siam, Thailand, actually had two kings up until 1939, just living there side by side as they always had in the pre-modern era. So they were treated much more kind of what I'm just calling peacefully. So it just means that Malays don't feel part of the nation, they don't want to be part of the nation, They say we have no relationship between our ethnic group and the nation. Whereas the Lanna people feel part of the nation. Do they want to be part of the nation? Well, that depends on how you treat them. And their view of their relationship between the nation and ethno-region is the nation is a subset of our region, because we came first. Okay, so then we have our two regions that were less cohesive, less autonomous in the pre-modern era. And they too were differentiated by how peacefully or conflictually they were incorporated into the modern nation state. So we have here the Bakdai, the southern Thai region, very peaceful incorporation, right? It's almost like there was a seamless transition between them being a tributary of Siam in the city of Nakhon Si Thammarat to just being a part of the new modern Thai nation state. Whereas the Isan region generally actually was just not inhabited for most of the pre-modern era. It was only in the 1700s when the Lao kingdom broke down and people began migrating there to escape conflict that they actually came into that region. So most of the people living in Isan today, maybe the best we can describe them are like recent migrants from the 1700s, right? Rather than having been in that place for hundreds of years in kind of like a cohesive Lao kingdom that incorporated the entirety of the Isan region. There are different parts of the Isan region, I'll just say that right now, that have some slightly different histories, but that's the majority of them. Okay, so those are my four regions there. I wanted to talk a little bit about two of the regions in a little bit more detail. I've kind of enlarged them here so that we can see it. So starting with the Lanna region, what were they like in the pre-modern era? Well, they date back their history to the Kingdom of Nyanyan in 1850 AD. Which was located about 100 miles north of Chiang Mai. The 25th king of Nyanyan, King Mang Rai, came down, moved the capital down to first Chiang Rai and then Chiang Mai, and founded what we then called the Lanna Kingdom. This is generally the Lanna Kingdom. This is Chiang Mai here. This is Chiang Rai and Chiang Saen is further north than that. This is the general area of the Lanna Kingdom right there. And you can kind of see some entrepreneurial person has tried to draw a map with boundaries. And although for most people who study this era know that they didn't have territorial boundaries during this period of time, this is kind of a rough estimation of where their power kind of extended to. So we can kind of see that they were quite autonomous, right? From the Siamese kingdom of Ayutthaya up there in the north. In fact, there is a statue in the center of Chiang Mai, the Three Kings statue, that celebrates the so-called parity between the kings of Lanna, Ayutthaya, and then the old kingdom of Phayao that was then subsumed by Lanna later on. Ayutthaya tried quite a few times to attack Lanna in the 14 and 1500s, was never successful, before the Burmese were successful. So the Burmese come from up here in the northwest, and they take over Lanna for a couple of hundred years, minus a little blip in the 1600s where Siam takes over for 12 years. But this period, the pre-modern era ends with Siam actually helping Lanna escape the clutches of Burma and become independent once again. Still a tributary to Siam, but an independent, fairly autonomous tributary. So that's how the Lanna pre-modern era ends. In contrast, the Isan period, again, historically sparsely populated. Siam did have an eastern outpost there in Korat, in the Nakhon Si Thammarat. Again, I've kind of said this already, but in the 1700s, we begin to see migrations of Lao coming over here. This is the old Nakhon Si Thammarat mandala that spreads out across there. But generally, most of this was so sparsely populated, nobody even bothered fighting a war over these places. So that's most of the history there. This is after the Lao kingdom splits into 4 different component parts. And then we start seeing migrants come from these big cities down to the plateau there. Okay, so, and even in the pre-modern era, so this is something I didn't actually know, and I had to do quite a lot of research about, was I was trying to figure out how often Lan Xang actually fought a war with Siam. And right now, so if anybody wants to tell me something different, give me new sources. I cannot find very many instances of when they were united of them fighting wars. There's one time when an official who tries to usurp the throne in Sukhothai escapes the Vientiane, and then Siam comes and punishes them in a little war. Other than that, I can find very few instances of conflict before this period of time between those two states. So again, if somebody wants to help me out with that, they can. Right at the tail end of the pre-modern era, Vientiane, which is now its own kingdom, actually helps the Burmese attack Ayutthaya and sack it. So this is the great sacking of Ayutthaya in 1767. So the Siamese were not happy with that. King Daksin, when he comes into power, he immediately goes back and says, right, I'm taking over all of these Lao kingdoms, you're now part of Siam, right? So that's how the pre-modern era ends. And these are all gradually more and more dependent on Bangkok during that period of time. So again, we have two regions, one that's fairly autonomous, that's Lanna, and one which is less autonomous, at least in the region that is now current-day Thailand, right? Those are mostly those migrants from the 1700s. So how were they incorporated into the modern Thai state? I've kind of given some insight to this already. Siam helps Lanna escape the clutches of the Burmese, and then helps place somebody on the throne who's actually his brother-in-law. Interestingly, his brother-in-law is allowed fairly autonomous reign even into the modern era. For example, when Siam signs the Bohrin Treaty in 1873, King Govindarath says, nah, we don't want anything to do with that. And the Siamese king says, yeah, well, I guess we can't force you. So they're fairly independent. This is King Govindarath here. In 1874, Siam finally says, okay, let's try and incorporate this thing into Siam proper. They send up some permanent commissioners, like they do everywhere else. And after a few years, the king of Lanna says, yeah, actually, I think I want my powers back. And so the king of Siam says, okay, you can have it back. So they then get their full powers back as a fully independent monarchy again for a few years. In 1883, King Chulalongkorn says this: we consider Chiang Mai as still not belonging to the kingdom proper because it is still a protectorate or a tributary state. This is how independent the monarchy up in the north is. They begin to engage in a very European practice of intermarrying. So Princess Dararatsumi is very famous in the north here. There's actually rumors that Queen Victoria wanted to adopt her as her adopted daughter-in-law to kind of tie the thrones of Lanna and Britain together. So King Rama, which Rama was it at this period of time? I think it was Rama V, right? There you go. Chulalongkorn says, yeah, we're not having anything of that. He sends an envoy up to go and marry Dararatsumi straight away. Eventually, they're incorporated as administratively, but they don't actually get forced to do any of the administrative reforms until 1917, so much later than anywhere else in the kingdom. And as I've already said, the last king of Chiang Mai survives until 1939. Here he is there. And at that period of time, he has an heir apparent, right? An heir to the throne who has an official title. The king of Siam says, well, you're not going to get to become king, but you can keep your title. He passes away in 1972. These are pictures from the royally sponsored cremation service, where King Bhumibol actually oversees the entire thing. So as late as 1972, you're having the royal family of Lanna being treated still in very favorable terms. Compare this to Isan. So many of you, or some of you may know this history, right? At the beginning of the modern period, right after we signed the Burnley Treaty with England in 1826. In 1827, the king of Vientiane thinks it's going to be a really good idea to attack Siam. So he does it, right? He goes and attacks Siam, and the Siamese just retaliate, right? They go in, they sack Vientiane, they take a bunch of different Buddha statues. They empty the population, and unlike anywhere else, because they do that quite often in the pre-modern era, but here they're not even going to get to rebuild. We're just stripping the whole thing, right? They begin taking everybody, tattooing all of the Lao, bringing them over to the Isan Plateau. Vientiane is just gone, right? So by the time the French get there, this is what their Pravihan looks like. What one is this? The Wat Pagel in the middle of Vientiane right now, which is being rebuilt. But it almost reminds you of Angkor Wat, right? Covered in jungle. The Siamese just completely destroyed that place, right? So we begin our modern era with the Lao being forcibly incorporated and in a very distrustful way, right? So Siam, as they're now drawing borders because they have to, because the British are making them and the French, they're like, okay, we'll just have all of that, please. We'll have all of Cambodia too. They go through, they replace all of the kings in Champasak and in Vientiane. They're like, okay, your family's gone, we'll have another family in charge there. They begin building cities all over the Isan Plateau. And then they make deals, right, with these individual now governors that they give titles to. They're all tied right down to Bangkok, heavily tied to Bangkok, but they're not given very high titles. So the highest title that they're given is, I think, like Kun or Prat, where the kings and other places down here get Praya or something like that. But anyway, they have very limited titles up here as well. So they're very reliant on Bangkok. They don't get treated as well, and they're essentially kind of forced and distrusted. Another interesting thing is, because all of these kind of elite families were fairly new, once they make the transition over to the new administrative system, none of these elite families survive. So you can look at all of the governorships right after, in the new modern era, there's no elite families in there. And Vickery has written a really good essay that tracks all of those things. Down in the South, they made a much better transition to the new administration. There's lots of elite families that make it into the new administration. And there's lots of intermarriage between elite families there and in Bangkok as well. So they survive. The Lanna, we've already said, survives in terms of their monarchy. But the Isan elite is treated very differently. Okay. So that's kind of the history. It feels really dark here. But that's kind of the history of where those styles come from. I've kind of already shown you that these styles exist, right, in terms of we can detect them in surveys. So what does this mean? I started off saying that I wanted to understand why some regions might be more susceptible to separatism, why the Lanna region had kind of interpreted these political grievances that Thailand has had over the last 2 decades in ethnic terms, whereas the Isan have interpreted them in much more civic, liberal democratic terms. And so I actually hone in on this intervening mechanism, susceptibility to ethnic rhetoric. And here I'm going to kind of really depart from anything historical, anthropological, and talk about something that we do in political science, because basically we don't have our own discipline, right? We just borrow from everybody else. So we borrow from history, we borrow from anthropology. Here I'm going to borrow from psychology a little bit, okay? So we have this history with these the styles of nationalism. Then we have some type of grievance that comes along that affects their susceptibility to ethnic rhetoric, which will determine how they behave in terms of ethno-political behavior. So what I did, so I know some political scientists would love to, when they do experiments, right, they would love to, let's go to this part of the world and we will get to change leaders and maybe some will incite a civil war. We can't do that, right? The IRB wouldn't let us, that wouldn't be ethical to do things like that, right? So they satisfied themselves with trying to detect some of these mechanisms in surveys and using experimental surveys. So I have in the book borrowed one of these techniques where I have tried to play the role of an ethnic entrepreneur. So with some colleagues in Chiang Mai, we wrote this text to try and sound like the type of text that you might read in an op-ed, right? That is, speaking very favorably of the region, trying to kind of drum up that ethno-regional support. We're not trying to drum up any kind of separatist, violent behavior or anything like this, but this is how it reads. The Isan identity is of great importance to the Isan people. This identity has helped us in both good times and bad. The Isan identity is made up of many components, most importantly, our Isan language. I tried to vary which different components just to see if it had an effect. Turns out it didn't, they all have a very similar effect. Which has served us as a unifying symbol of communication for our people in the Isan region for many centuries. Where would Isan be without the Isan language? As the new year ushers in, because we did this around the new year, let us take some time to think about the influence of the Isan language and our Isan identity in strengthening our regionalism. Okay? So we wrote that to try and just get them feeling all proud, right, of their region. But I had very different predictions about how this would pan out. Now, right after they read this, I asked them some standard questions, right? So there was a control group that read nothing, right? And so all of these results are averages compared to a control group. But right after they read that, they got to answer 4 questions on how strong their identity was, their regional versus their national one, support for a regional party, support for a regional-oriented policy. We chose a language policy, so funding for a language board, and then support for some form of increased autonomy. We didn't say separatism, we didn't want to be accused of sedition or anything like that. But you can have increased autonomy with decentralization too. So we left it up to their imaginations on those things. But so we asked them these 4 things to kind of measure how responsive they were to various types of ethno-political activity. So we had different predictions for each of the 4, right? Again, unfortunately, we couldn't get down into the 3 southern provinces, but if we had, we would have predicted that they would have reacted very strongly to that and become much more regional and supportive of regional things. In Lanna, which is our kind of posterior nationalism, we predicted that they would also be responsive, just not as responsive as the far south. In the southern Thai region, in the Pak Thai region, we didn't think that there would be any effect at all. We just thought they would be like, we're just happy to be here, right? We love being Thai, we love being Pak Thai, southern Thai as well. But then in the Isan region, we predicted, or I predicted, that there would be a kickback effect, right? Just like you saw in those surveys, where we asked them to describe their regional identity, and they would say, hang on a second, we know what you're trying to do. You're trying to say we're not Thai. So we predicted, I predicted that they would have a kickback effect. And when you try and prime them to be more regional in their feelings, they would actually act more national afterwards. And this actually worked out. Again, I don't have any results on this, but these 3 regions acted exactly the way that we thought that they would. And I have now repeated the same experiment in the UK, not just in Wales and Scotland, but also in Cornwall and regions of England. And most recently this summer in Spain as well, whereby I previously coded all of the different regions based on their histories for these different types. And it's a very strong result, right? So this intervening mechanism of susceptibility to ethnic rhetoric, I think really kind of helps us predict, based on that history, the style of nationalism that they have and their propensity for some type of separatist or ethno-nationalist movement in the future. Well, I think that's it. So thank you very much. I'm going to filter questions. Do you mind if I fill up my water here? The humidity's got me.
Yeah.
Okay, yes, wonderful.
Yeah, on that last slide, I just want to clarify.
Yes.
What was up? Yeah, it says predicted ethnic political behavior. The way you explained it was not behavior per se. Susceptibility.
Susceptibility, that's right. Yeah. Yeah, so you're right. This is a incorrectly titled slide. So these are more about attitudes, right? Attitudes that we measure in the survey, right? Which I would think might predict in the future, right? Given a certain type of grievances, because there's a lot that goes into instigating a region into actually turning to that behavior. So, and I'm certainly, this is not like a perfectly predictive model. It's kind of probabilistic and things like that. But yes, this is incorrectly titled. It should be attitudes. Thank you. Yeah.
The scholar anthropologist, If Cox, wrote a bit on the Isan area. I'm trying to remember, as I listen to you, it seems that what you're finding doesn't quite jive with what he argues, which has a stronger, as I recall, this were stronger argument having to do with Isan independence or separate from Thailand.
So first of all, I should say that this is very separate than just kind of social salience of the identity. One of the things that's really interesting and you call him Biff, I just Charles, because that's how he writes it. So Charles Cave, he writes a lot. I mean, they have a very salient identity for sure. One of the things that the survey measures actually is that this identity, the Bakayu identity, is actually just as salient on a whole number of different battery of questions. So I found that really interesting because I didn't know much about that region before. So certainly, Charles Cave writes that they're socially salient. In one of his most recent edited volumes, when he writes about the type of political behavior that the Isan engage in, he writes that they actually engage in much more of this kind of liberal civic nationalism, whereby they're much more likely to try and approach things, using grassroots NGOs, demanding for involvement and participation, then turn into a type of separatism. So in one of his books, and I have it cited in my book, I actually quote directly from him, because I think his phrase, and I want to say it's something like liberal democratic nationalism, he uses a phrase like that, I think captures this quite well, which is, yes, they are nationalistic, they want to be accepted as part of the nation, and the way that they kind of approach this is by saying, we need to be a democracy. Everybody needs to be an equal citizen here. So they are very active. They go down to Bangkok, they protest, they start organizations like the Forum for the Poor and different things like this. And I think lots of people misinterpret that as saying, oh, well, that's cultural nationalism or separatism. It's a nationalism, a type of civic nationalism. But, I've tried to read his work carefully, and I actually think that he would, don't want to put words in his mouth, but I think he would probably agree with it. Some of the other writers, like I said, Jacob Ritz from Singapore, who has kind of written a lot about Isan, he talks about how the Isan people actually use the national identity as a means of social mobility too. And so, yeah, they definitely are separate, they have a strong identity, but in terms of politics and political expression, it's not about separatism. But we definitely saw that in Lanna in 2013-14. Yeah.
Sure. You didn't use the word status, I don't think, but that's a really important idea in hierarchies and status in politics. And in reading sort of between the lines, is there a status differential issue here that people perceive? Like you mentioned earlier that I was saying people food or whatever it's go about. And is I guess how does that fit into your story?
Yeah, I mean, I think it feeds into this feeling, right, that the Isan people feel like they're not fully accepted into the Thai national identity. And that's why they kept telling me off in that open-ended section, right? They kept saying, I know what you're trying to do. You're trying to investigate this thing which lots of scholars have come to try and do, but we're trying to tell you that we are Thai, right? And stop trying to cause us division. So I think a lot of this kind of psychology, right? It could be, another way to phrase it is because they feel like they have a lower status within the nation, right? And again, this is precisely why I wanted to field it in a forum like this, because in many ways, my Americanist methodologically oriented colleagues would just kind of accept the language that I use and say, okay, that makes sense to us as long as you measure it. But yeah, so status, I think, plays into this. And so I think there's a status of the majority group looking down and it probably even saying, I think this is probably behind the coup and lots of those political activities. You don't get to be a full citizen because you're not educated enough, right? Your country bumpkins, they like that phrase a lot. But I think the Isan people, I've actually had probably the most educated discussions with taxi drivers from Isan about politics, right? They know their politics really well, and they can have like hours-long conversations on it. But I think they would fill that status, but they want to get rid, right? They want to be accepted as full citizens. And, like I said, they have a really sophisticated understanding of democracy, democratic politics, elections, and things like that. But I'm gonna consider that word and see if I can incorporate it.
So when you're telling that, because the Lanna people also the red shirts, but have this quite different response.
Yeah, so here I would think it's more of a response of it's like, hang on a second. I thought the understanding here was, right, that we're all Thais, we're part of this project because we came in willingly. And now all of a sudden you're I mean, maybe they're even comparing themselves to Isan. I've never heard that personally. But maybe they're saying things like, now all of a sudden you're treating us like you're treating Isan people. Like, those are our prime ministers. Those two people are on Chiang Mai, right? You don't get to do this. So I think one of the reasons why they kind of responded and created retro organizations of that nationalist flavor, of that variety, is precisely because they probably had a different psychological status that they felt was violated in this whole process of the last 20 years. So, yeah, I like that word status. I didn't think about that whole area.
Thanks very much. I'm just laughing because I'm an anthropological archaeologist, so I like history too.
Yes.
And I really enjoyed this. It got me all riled up. Let's become corrections. I'm not a political scientist. Sorry. First one is I worked in Central Thailand as an archaeologist. People who called themselves Lao. And when we asked them, "Oh, you're Lao," they said, "So you're from Lao?" "Oh, no, your parents were. No, my grandparents. No, we're Lao because we got here in the 19th century."
Yeah.
Okay. Then I work in Cambodia, and to Cambodians, part of Isan is Khmer Sarin. It is Khmer.
Yeah.
Right? And people there are Khmer. Now, Cambodians in Cambodia, they say, well, Khmer Sarin is very different from Cambodia, very different from how much you're from. But yeah, they're all Khmer. So when I hear you talk about this, I think it might be worth looking at class and ethnicity, because Isan has been forced the Iron Age.
Yes.
We had problems with droughts back then, archaeologists will assure you. On the one hand, and on the other hand, people feel very strongly that they identify with ethnic groups. So Khmers have been there probably since the 11th century, and maybe earlier, based on some of the temples, right? But they're Thai citizens.
Yes.
And they're Khmer.
Yeah.
So I don't know anything about the Lao history. Maybe some of your students here can talk about that. But I can tell you from the point of view of Khmers that they feel fully Khmer, but they want Thai citizenship. And to them, there's a big difference between ethnicity and citizenship. And probably if they were part of that protest, the protest is to say we belong in Thailand, we are Thai, and we are also Khmer, right?
Yes.
Whereas, and then the other piece, which I also don't understand that much about, there has been this movement in the last 80 to 90 years to develop a sense of Thai-ness, right?
Yes.
I don't know how much is marketing, I don't know how much is political strategy, other people here are much more interested. So there's this notion of Thai-ness as creating this culture. There's also the recognition or the demand by some populations that they are Lao, and they're always going to be Lao, and their kids are going to be Lao. It doesn't matter if it's 250 years, and they're going to eat Lao food, and they're going to speak Lao, even if they're in Hungary. That was my experience.
Yeah.
So I think the class and ethnicity are very important issues because Isan has been such a.
Yeah.
But I'd like to hear from other people know more about Thailand. I really
So let me respond to a couple of things. So I think I'm always going to leave anthropologists feeling very unsatisfied with my work, right? Because I'm looking at average effects of a region, and obviously you work close with a Lao population that's already in central Thailand. So like you said, far away, and probably have a different type of experience, right? And of course, that matters. What I'm trying to do here is push the envelope a little bit further, right, from works like Tongchai, where we have the development of nationalism, and it seems like it envelops the whole country, right? And what I'm trying to say is there are different styles of nationalism that developed in each region. So I do think that within the Isan region, if you're thinking about the Lao population there, yeah, I think a lot of that inequality feeds into these notions that they are less than in some way, both from the prejudice from the central Thai and their own kind of perceptions of how they fit into that. I did actually do some what they call focus groups this past summer with Khmer in Buriram, just because I really wanted to try and understand how they viewed themselves. And you're right, so much of this, they definitely say, yeah, we're Khmer, we speak Khmer, and they identify as that. But
they're also Thai. But
they are also Thai, and they went to great lengths to convince me, right? Saying, hey, we know you're here. You may not understand much about our region because you're from America, from the West, whatever. Let us just tell you that we are both, right? And of course, one may be an ethnicity, one may be a nationalism, and I'm trying to focus on that nationalism too. So again, and maybe this gets back to one of the first comments. this is different than just social salience. So I don't want to say these other things don't exist, but I think the national identity itself is a separate layer, and especially politicized nationalism.
But if that's the case, it's a kickback against nationalist rhetoric rather than just ethnic.
Yeah, so maybe here I should have said ethno-nationalist rhetoric. So the type of rhetoric, again, I tried to do here, I mean, it was based on region and ethnicity. I mean, it's kind of, maybe I'm a little bit too loose with the terms here, and I haven't quite ironed them out. But I mean, this is what we generally refer to as an ethno-nationalist rhetoric, right? So I should probably just be more careful with some of those terms. And right, this is actually the first time I've presented this, so I'm going to. Yeah.
Compare Central Thailand. I thought that's what you were.
Yeah, so I do have central ties in here. I run this with central ties too. They're not actually. No, they're not. I didn't show them in here. The central ties, again, like the back tie, they don't have any reaction. And I actually separate out northerners. So I do a separate experiment because the lower half of the north are actually central tie speakers. And so I try and see if I can regionalize them with anything. But they act very much like the back tie and the central ties, which is, they're just like, they just don't have any average effects in those surveys. Which, yeah.
I just want to change. I sold from Thailand, and people there, they have the strongest nationalist sentiment.
Yeah.
Even more in the Central Thai sometimes. Because during the protest in the student protest in recent year, and I gave you some talk that I'm sure you heard of Patani, and Yala. There's no protest, and zero protest that I cannot speak.
Yeah.
Whereas like in the South, it's very much that. And I would like to maybe like exchange about the political result, like especially the constitution result that you showed earlier.
Yes.
Can you go back to the
The maps with the
constitution in 2016?
You like that map too, right? We're gonna get there. Going back in history. Ah, it's really, oh, there you go. Okay.
Yeah, I think apart from your observation on ethnic divide between the northern part, eastern part and the south. Also, it's clearly reflect that this region is a military.
Yes.
Because it was written by the military.
Yes.
That's why, and I was in the south, and people was just saying, to be would yes or no. And
Yes.
especially inside, they were saying that was a part in the constitution. Saying Buddhism is the majority religions of the people.
Yes.
So they were really afraid that like they would be dominated by Buddhists. So in the South, they were saying, okay, we should win, but we don't want to be dominated. And like in the constitution, it said like we will support Buddhism and learning of Buddhism and protection of
So
Buddhism.
that explains that the Malay movement.
Yeah.
Yeah, so here's a couple of things that I wanted to point out about Southern. I've really enjoyed, because very few people have written about the Southern ties. And so I really enjoyed like learning in the surveys, for example, that in terms of just social salience, their identity was as strong as these two regions. But you'll see that they don't have any of these ethno-nationalist movements, right? Mainly because they are on the same political side. So even the future imaginary, right? They were for some reason not on the same side and they had a grievance. I still don't think that they would react in the same way, right? That's what the model would predict. So social salience, first of all, is separate than that type of activity. The second thing that I'll say is that I started this project by turning to surveys done by the World Values Survey. I don't know if any of you have heard of this. It's an effort run by Ron Inglehart at the University of Michigan. He's actually just passed away in the last couple of years. But I worked with him at the University of Michigan. He started these things in the 80s. It's one of the most preeminent, cross-national things on values that there is in the world. And he's asked from the very beginning this question: how proud are you to be, and then your national identity? Thailand has 4 different surveys in the World Value Survey, and in all 4 of them, the Lanna people have the strongest, they are the proudest to be Thai, right? Followed closely by the Southern Thais and even the Northern Thais, the Central Thais are the ones that are a lot more, I guess they feel more able to be able to criticize and say we're not so proud of how things are. So, yeah, so again, one thing that I wanted to do was separate this idea that, does it mean that because the Lanna people have engaged in some separatist agitations, that they never were capable of feeling strongly Thai? And I think the evidence suggests that they were capable, and they still are capable, right? They still feel Thai, and they can express that national identity. I think this is where we can separate those things, but they can still be susceptible to this ethno-nationalist rhetoric that under certain circumstances, right, maybe 2 decades where you unconstitutionally remove prime ministers that they voted for, you can maybe push them in the other way. But one of the things that I wanted to kind of hammer home in this book is that I still think Lanna people feel Thai, even after all of this, right? They feel Thai, they feel part of the nation, but they're expressing something else here, right? That is, that's different than a national identity, different than a socially salient ethnic identity. And that's where I think that the state just needs to be more careful, right, with the ways that they deal and with some of their peripheral populations, is understanding how they react to some of these things. And then if we go next door to Myanmar, right, we see some efforts where there's zero understanding of how the periphery might respond to some of these things. But these are great clarifications. We should talk more about Southern Thailand and some of those results. Yes.
I have 2 questions from the Zooms. The first is from Michael Dunford. Forgive me as I read these questions.
Okay.
How much do you think the violent anti-communist, in parentheses, anti-CPT campaigns of the 60s and 70s had an impact on Isan's view toward Thai nationalism? E.g., the desire to be, quote, accepted as Thai, quote, is in reaction to suspicions of ideological rather than ethnic sedition.
Yeah, so that's a great question that I spent some time trying to investigate as well. And I reread Catherine Bowie's Rituals of National Loyalty, I want to say, one of her books where she deals specifically with the communist insurgency. She mentions the word ethnicity 0 times in her book. 0 times. And as you read through the book, even when she talks about some of the activity in the North, she describes it never in terms of ethnic separatism or ethnic activity. Now, do I still think that may had some effect? I think it certainly reinforced a process, like I said, that started in 1827, whereby the Lao were continually viewed as kind of traitors to the nation, right? And were forced to be part of this. I think in some ways, although, you know, I don't see tons of evidence that this was strongly ethnic in nature, but I do think that probably reinforced these dynamics that have been going on for already over a century.
And I have a second question from the Zoom, if you'll forgive me. This is from Jane Ferguson, who says, thank you for the presentation. The survey data is really interesting. In my experience, the Lanna nationalists are mostly middle class and higher, and Lanna is very much packaged for tourism as a place of great classic history. To what extent do you think this is a, quote, ethnic political behavior, quote, is about class aspirations, or is a matter to differentiate Lanna-ness as Sui Lai, forgive me, I might have said that correctly, to differentiate between so-called hill tribes?
Yeah.
You survey based on Lanna/Mueang, again, forgive me, as opposed to Lapu, Lisu, Kumang, and others.
Yeah. Oh, that's a fantastic question. Yeah, so who is driving this? And in some ways, I think I agree with this depiction, right? That it's this history, right? This history, and essentially you have elites that are continued to be allowed in this political system. So even after the last king dies in 1939, and the heir to the throne dies in 1972, you still have lots of Nat Ching Lais, which are people who are, people who are descendants of that Lanna royal family. And there's a lot of them, right? This is a big elite class across the whole region. So again, I don't have I mean, in terms of the survey data, I could kind of go into that. I haven't yet, and could kind of look at some of the class and education differences. But I do think, like a lot of these things, they are initially driven by elite, aspiring elite, and certainly the interviews that I had with people were with elites, right? They weren't with like village leaders or things like that. So I think essentially that's how those dynamics work. So in the survey where I say I try and mimic these ethnic entrepreneurs, I'm trying to mimic those people's languages, right? That I sat through in interviews with and heard them talk about politics in Lanna in those ways. And I was like, that's really interesting, the way that they are trying to frame this, right? And so, yeah, in some other work I've kind of published in a couple of article formats, I've looked at how some of the leadership of these movements actually came from kind of stemming out this tourist movement that started in the 80s and 90s, where the North was trying to sell its culture to Bangkok, right, for tourism purposes. There was a whole bunch of grassroots organizations organized during that period of time to revive language, to revive different culture. We actually had professors from universities going out to each village to try and revive all of these different aspects of culture. The whole floating of the lantern things was something that was revived during this period of time, which is kind of known as kind of like a northern thing. So yeah, and as these kind of civic organizations were created, there were lots of kind of leadership networks which were created during this period of time. So yeah, I would agree with that characterization of who is leading it. One of the things that I really wanted to do with the survey, I just wanted to see how widespread is this thing, right? Who actually buys into it? How susceptible are people on average? So that's my first kind of answer to that is, even though I kind of have a very similar sense based on interviews who was behind and leading in it, that there is at least enough. And again, I'm not saying this is widespread separatism that has taken over the entire of the North, because the data just doesn't support that. But I think there's enough sentiment there to differentiate them clearly from these other regions. Secondly, I do have within the Chiang Mai data and with another kind of associated survey, I have actually tried to kind of look at what the limits of Lanna-ness are in terms of, does it incorporate hill tribe people? Does it incorporate Muslims? There's a big Muslim community in Chiang Mai. So what are the limits of Lanna-ness? Is it just another kind of elite Thai-ness, or is it something that's more multi-ethnic? I haven't looked at those results yet. This is where I think they might go, based on what I've seen in other similar ethno-regional movements in Scotland and in Catalonia. Both of those ethno-regional movements are actually very multicultural in the way that they approach things, right? And so the SNP, the Scottish Nationalist Party, has promoted itself as being way more progressive in terms of multicultural acceptance than any party in Britain, and Catalonia, Barcelona as well. So again, I don't know the answer to this, but my feeling is that since those two regions are of a similar kind of nationalism style to the Isan region, that maybe part of this movement might be to say, hey, look, we're the progressive ones here, right? We're the most civilized ones, right? So forget the old Siamese down there, like the Scots say, forget the stuffy old British down in Westminster, right? We're the future. So that's where I might expect it to go, but until I look at the data, I wouldn't know. But that's one thing that I really wanted to know too, which, what are the limits of Lanna-ness?
Just on that, what you just said, John, maybe I misheard you, but isn't the Isan story in particular very different from the Catalonia story and the Scottish story, precisely because they're rejecting the idea of separatism?
This one is, yeah.
Yeah.
This is the one that would be more similar. The Lanna would be more similar to Scotland, Catalonia.
Yeah.
This is more similar to Valencia. So Valencia, right next door to Catalonia, speaks the same language. They call it Valencian. The Catalonians call it Catalonian, and they've had zero pushes for independence, right? And part, if you actually go back and look at the Valencian history, it's because they got locked off of this northeastern kingdom way before, and then they became really poor. Madrid came and sacked them. You know, it's a very similar story about a region that kind of gets turned into this very poor region and then just yearns to be Spanish nationals in that case.
Right.
Yeah.
I wonder if there were any economists. I think the economy, we don't need another more in social science. We've got, but the economists would probably say, look, this is a mystery, you know, it's the poorer part of the country, of course they want to stay. You know, they will be benefiting from transfers in the same way the poor parts of the United States benefit from transfers and so on, you know, there's nothing to be explained here.
Yeah.
They're just acting rational.
I would expect an economist to make that very same observation. So, and again, so some of this gets wrapped up in some of the history, right? The pre-history of this is why do regions become poorer in the first place, right? And some of that might have to do with this pre-modern history of not being so cohesive a region, right? Of cohesiveness. So, and again, I know that economists would love for me to run a multi-stage regression so that I can kind of rule out the fact that one thing affects the other thing in a different direction. But I can't entirely say because I actually have observed in these types of regions. So Wales is another region that wants to be British, and it happens to be traditionally the backwater of Britain, right? The poorer area. They also went through the same thing where Welsh was banned in schools. The actual roots of the eugenics movement were actually the English going down to Cornwall and Wales, measuring people's head circumference and height, and saying, now we know why Cornish and Welsh people are stupid, because they are less developed than the English. So they've had a whole bunch of this, but I can't rule out poverty as an underlying thing. But then I think there's something prior to that leads to kind of both of those things in that pre-modern era. So my answer to that would be, let's go back to the pre-modern era and look at their cohesiveness and things like that. But
And
Miriam,
it's what we study.
Okay.
Geographers is the real one. Isan geographically is a deep buffer.
yes,
It's not very arable, and so there is that issue. But the other point I would make, and I don't know how you could study it and what field studies it, but it sounds like what you're saying about Lanna is that the essence of this Lanna revitalization is that they feel like they're primordial time, which makes sense historically based on the Thai migration pattern.
Yeah.
But if they feel like they're primordial Thai, I hope you test the alternate hypothesis that in fact the tribes are not.
yeah,
That's one piece, and the other piece that I think, if you're gonna look historically or institutionally, you can't rule out Ayutthaya, and Ayutthaya has such a different history, right? So Lanna could be this primordial Thai kingdom, but Ayutthaya, well, it was multicultural, and they were speaking Khmer, and people are arguing about what's the relationship between these areas. So if you want to just be uber Thai, maybe you go to Lanna.
Yeah.
In this construction, which is a very beautiful construction.
So this is really interesting because if you look back at the history of Lanna after Chiang Mai was repopulated when it got independence from the Burmese, the first king, King Gawilirot, uses this phrase called putting vegetables into baskets. I don't know if you've heard this phrase. Basically, Chiang Mai was depopulated and he realized I need a population to build a kingdom. So he actually went, and mostly through force, went and attacked a bunch of places up in the hill tribes and different things, and brings these vegetables and puts them into the basket of Chiang Mai. That's his very nice phrase he used for capturing slaves and forcing them to move to Chiang Mai. But he basically repopulates Chiang Mai. So ethnically, you could actually argue that Chiang Mai is a complete modern construction as well. But yeah, I mean, one of the things that I think this survey data on Lanna, the limits of Lanna-ness will help for me sort out is, at least are the modern day Lanna, is this movement, is it billing itself as a primordial identity, or is it billing itself as, hey, we're actually the more advanced pre-modern thing that is more open to these other groups? I don't know the answer to that yet. But certainly, I think amongst the elites, if we go back to this elite mentality, it is probably right, this competition to say, hey, here's an opportunity for us to kind of make something here and to maybe claim this primordialness here. But yeah, I mean, for me right now, that's an empirical question that I don't know the answer to, but I think would be fascinating to learn. How are they viewing their Lanna-ness right now? So, yeah.
Just along those lines, having studied sort of regionalism in Asia, there's a sense of like everyone's reacting to either sort of Indonesian national identity, Javanization, sort of center periphery, right? But what I also found is like it's not just about like center periphery, but it's sort of periphery relations, right? So it's like feeling a minority within a minority region, a minority of a minority. I was just sort of curious, this brings in those sort of both kind of discussion. Like how much of those dynamics of like Lanna is about relative to Thai identity versus relative to other kinds of identities in the more peripheral parts. So,
yeah, I mean, I think these dynamics are. This is the sad thing about studying ethnicity and nationalism, right? Which is once any group gets into power, they have this tendency to act badly, right? And to try and push themselves to the top. So I've mentioned that Scotland and Catalonia are billing themselves, at least their nationalist parties, as these very tolerant multi-ethnic parties, because hey, that's what Scotland and Catalonia are, unlike London and Madrid, right? This isn't to say once they get their own countries, that's how they're going to act, and there's not going to be racism and xenophobia, right? And all of these other things. So, yeah, this is one of those sad things about human nature, right? That so yeah, I mean, right now, if it's politically beneficial, right, then maybe that's how they might copy this Scottish Catalonia model. But I think anybody who spent time in the north knows that there is prejudice against those hill tribe populations. Still not 100% clear to me if that is a Thai state thing or if that is a Lanna majority against those minorities. But this is not, that's kind of not my area of expertise. I haven't read tons about, but yeah, I'm really kind of looking forward to exploring that data, to, at least in a survey context, to see if I can figure out how some of these people are reacting to some of these minority groups within them. And by the way, I contacted Ahinka because I just read his book. I was like, oh, that's somebody I need to get some feedback from. So,
all right. Well, our time has come to an end. There's lots more things I would have liked to talk to Joel about. I would have liked to clarify some things you made about Hawaii. But we can talk about that later. And it would be interesting to think about where that might fit into your context as well. But really, thank you for a really thoughtful presentation. Thank you, everyone, for wonderfully engaging. And for those that are able, please come to the potluck and we can talk about Joel. But otherwise,
everyone is.
thank you so much, everybody.
Thank you.
I really
You're all welcome to stay, keep eating. We'll just shut down the Zoom and all that.
apologize for spilling my.
I love what you had to say. It was very stimulating.
Thank you so much.
I would just say, is the Zoom still on?
The Zoom is still on. Okay.